You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians.
Dear listeners, this time we are going to talk about the background and possible outcomes of the early legislative elections that were held on the 30th of January 2022 in Portugal. Today, we have the pleasure to have Mr. Alexandre de Sousa Carvalho with us, right from the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra. Mr. Carvalho's main field of research includes discourse, semiotics and political representations, internet and social change, as well as populism and masculinities. Mr. Carvalho is a PhD candidate in political science at the University Institute of Lisbon. Hey, Alexandre, it gives us a great joy that you accepted our invitation. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So as to start, the next legislative election was originally scheduled for October 2023. However, a snap election was called for due to the rejection of the 2022 state budget, during which the left-wing parties joined the right-wing ones, voting against the proposal. Both the left bloc and the Portuguese Communist Party, which had previously backed the government, have joined the opposition's center-right to right-wing blocs in rejecting the budget. Let me just very quickly share some basic facts with our audience about the election results. In the Assembly of the Republic, the Socialist Party of incumbent Prime Minister António Costa secured an unexpected majority for the second time in the party's history. The left-wing party obtained around 42% of the vote, equaling to 117 parliamentary seats, one more than the necessary majority. The Socialist Party won the most votes in all districts but the autonomous region of Madeira. The Liberal Conservative Social Democratic Party stayed stable but underperformed surveys that projected a close battle with the Socialists. The party won around 29% of the vote, a slightly higher share than in the former legislative election, but received one seat less. The National Conservative right-wing populist CHEGA party finished in third place, winning roughly 7% of the vote. The Liberal Initiative came in fourth place with 5%. Both parties saw an increase in voter turnout and gained ground in this election. So, Mr. Carvalho, how would you describe the parties that managed to get in the National Assembly and what are their main characteristics?
So, Balan, thank you for your question. We have 9 political parties in parliament right now. We have the 2 main political parties, the Socialist Party and the Social Democrats. Many of these political party names are not necessarily accurate in terms of ideology, but they're accurate in relative terms to other political parties. The Portuguese Socialist Party is not actually a socialist party in the traditional or classical sense, more like a new labor or third way centrist party. So the Socialist Party has been one of the 2 main parties, one of the 2 ruling parties in Portugal since constitutional democracy was reinstated in 1976. Unlike the Social Democrats, the Socialists generally rule alone. Then there's the Social Democrat Party, or PSD, which is a bit more diverse in terms of ideology. So it's sometimes more centrist, sometimes center-right, sometimes neoliberal. So these are the 2 major democratic parties in Portugal. Maybe the Christian Democrats would be the third political party, but since these elections, they have lost all their seats in parliament, but they have been in power in coalition with the Socialists one time in 1977, but then more generally, they have been in power in coalitions with the Social Democrats. And then we have the Communist Party, which is actually the oldest party in Portugal because it was founded in 1921. The second oldest political party in existence is the Socialist Party, which was created in 1973. And then the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats were created just after the revolution in 1974. Portuguese Communist Party officially is considered to be a Marxist-Leninist. On the other hand, there's the left bloc, which in the last elections was the 3rd largest party, and now it has become like the 6th. And the left bloc was created in the late 90s, and it's a mixture of different smaller political parties. They're also very ideologically diversified. We consider themselves Marxists, feminists, Trotskyites, democratic socialists, and so on. So these were the 5 major parties 2015 was a landmark because up until 2015, whoever was the most voted political party was the party in government, regardless if it had an absolute majority or a relative majority. This has changed in 2015 because after 4 years of Pedro Passos Coelho and Paulo Portas, so the leaders of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, they made a coalition together, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, but they did not have a parliamentary majority. And so for the first time in Portuguese democratic history, we had the left, especially the left bloc and the Communist Party, saying that the socialists will not be government only if they don't want to. If the socialists agree to a memorandum of understanding between them, the left in parliament would support socialist-led government. For many decades, it was considered that even though we could have the Communist Party or even the left bloc in parliament, they were generally considered by opposition as protest parties, as parties that would not contribute to the governing of the country. And that wall collapsed in 2015. What we witness now in 2022 is fragmentation across the political spectrum. The socialists have gained an absolute majority. The Social Democrats gained around 30% of the vote. And these two parties make up for, I think, over 2/3 of parliament. What we are witnessing in this election in 2022 is actually the reinforcement of the political center, so between the socialists and the Social Democrats. We also have political parties to the left of the socialists taking a huge loss. So the Communist Party lost half of their representation, and the left bloc lost 14 of their representatives. And on the right, we kind of have the Social Democrat Party somewhat in the same values that it generally has in the last 20 years, but we have a resurgence on the right of the Social Democrats between the Liberal Initiative, which is kind of economic libertarian and liberal political party, and we have the rise of CHEGA. These two parties had only one MP in the 2019 elections, and now they have 12 and 8 MPs, even though these three political parties combined do not have a majority. Finally, we have two other political parties in parliament, the Animalists, Ecologists, Green Party called PAN, standing for People, Animals and Nature, had 4 MPs in 2019, and we have Livre, the person that they elected in 2019, was then in a few months expelled from the party, and now they re-elected a new MP. What I haven't talked about is that the Christian Democrats, which were historically one of the 3 political parties of the government arch, and they have now lost all political seats in parliament.
Thank you very much for all this very detailed information. You mentioned considerable changes in the Portuguese political scene, but do you think that the recent leadership changes within the Social Democratic Party, the Liberal Initiative, the CDS People's Party and the People's Animals Nature Party affected these parties' performances during this ballot?
In the Christian Democrats, definitely. In the Liberal Initiative as well. The Christian Democrats elected in 2019 Francisco Rodrigues dos Santos, a young leader of that section in the Christian Democrats previously. They used to have a really charismatic leader in Paulo Portas, Deputy Prime Minister from the Passos Coelho government from 2011 to 2015. Well, there was kind of a sentiment since 2015, since that Berlin Wall collapsed between the socialists and the parties to socialist left, that, okay, maybe the country is demographically, socially more to the left. And if the left, they now are accepting it and embracing it, it might be the case that the right might never rise to power again. Francisco Rodrigues dos Santos, so the leader of the Christian Democrats, became kind of a meme, kind of a joke, mostly because political communication strategies. Even till this election, there was a kind of an infamous political advertisement with the leader of the Christian Democrats. During the Christmas time, Christian Democrats made a video of the leader, Chicão, talking at an empty dinner table about how he's preparing the dinner, but he's making like a metaphor between the Christmas table and the country or parliament. In this chair used to sit our cousin from the center right. And this chair is our little brother from the radical far right party, and so on. And it became kind of a joke. They didn't do well, even though the Christian Democrats actually had more votes, for instance, than the PAN or Livre Both parties elected one MP. The problem is the Christian Democrats might have had more votes nationally. They were too dispersed geographically to actually gain them a seat in parliament. The Liberal initiative started with a different leader than they currently have. I would say the change was for the better. Coutinho Figueiredo, which is the new leader, rose to the occasion. Not only he had a more coherent and calm discourse than generally the communication from the political party. The Liberal Initiative is one of the new parties on the right, and the political communication of the party very much based on humorous marketing. But Coutinho Figueiredo had a more serious tone, which gave him more credibility, not only to him, but to the political party. The Liberal Initiative was also one of the main political parties that was vocal against how the pandemic was being managed. And I think that also resonated a lot with young people.
You mentioned that quite creative metaphoric campaign element of the Christian Democrats with the dinner table. How did the campaign go? Did the pandemic change the campaign methods compared to the previous elections?
I wouldn't say so. This was our third election in 1 year. We had a presidential election in January 2021. We had local council elections in September 2021. In one sense, the campaign was obviously conditioned by the pandemic. People are kind of weary and tired of the pandemic, and especially because we are generally portrayed as one of the countries where we are dealing the best with the pandemic. We have a highly vaccinated population. So the campaign didn't change much because of the pandemic, because by now we're kind of used to it. And the topic of the campaign was pretty much a single topic. The idea of stability or a stable government was pretty much the only discussion in the debates. A secondary topic, which is related to the stability, is the implementation of the Recovery and Resilience Plan. And it's something that the Prime Minister already had campaigned during the local council elections in September 2021. The Recovery and Resilience Plan was somewhat weaponized by saying that it was a vast amount of money. It was the last opportunity Portugal would ever have getting EU funds in this quantity. And therefore, this narrative kind of reinforces the Socialist Party plead for a stable government. It's worth noting that the Socialist Party retained a vast majority in local elections in September 2021, but it had a worse result than previous local elections. Even though the Socialist Party retained a vast majority in local councils, it lost the capital and it lost some middle-sized cities like Coimbra, where I live, Figueira da Foz, and Funchal in Madeira. And we were kind of witnessing a repetition of this. In the local elections, the city hall was governed by the Socialist Party. All the polls indicated a huge majority for the Socialists. As the local election date drew closer, the majority would keep getting thinner and thinner. The Socialist Party actually lost Lisbon City Hall, mostly because no one believed that the Social Democrats could win Lisbon City Hall, and they actually did. So there was a demobilization of voting to the left. Every poll was indicating that this is a sure win for the Socialists. The Socialists actually ended up losing the Lisbon City Hall, and it turned out to be a huge win for the Social Democrats. What happened in 2022 was that in the beginning, no one believed that the Social Democrats could win the election. There was no chance that this result could escape the Socialists. And that was a major mobilizing force in the left, because the right wing, the Social Democrats, could never win an absolute majority. And that became a huge turning point for mobilizing the electorate of the Communist Party and the left bloc towards the Socialist Party. During the discussions in Parliament of the state budget, President of the Republic, former leader of the Social Democrats, said that if the budget would be rejected in Parliament, he would call elections. This was a week before the vote. He did what I think he thought, but he made a political decision. We have a parliamentary system. And even though there was never a national budget rejected in Parliament, it's not a clear-cut case that if the budget was rejected, we would have necessarily to go to snap elections. That was a decision of the President of the Republic, and it was based on a political analysis. There's nothing preventing the socialist government from resubmitting a new budget proposal. Legally, that is true. The President of the Republic received in his chambers the someone who was running for the leadership of the Social Democrats. I think we need to talk about tactics in all of this crisis. Discussion and voting in Parliament of the budget was in October. There was internal leadership voting in the Christian Democrats, in the Social Democrats, in the Liberal Initiative, and in CHEGA. I think the Socialist Party read that moment and decided to present a budget that would be unacceptable for the left bloc and for the communists. From a tactical point of view, I think the socialists saw an opportunity to take advantage of a rejection of the budget, blame it entirely on its left, and take advantage of the internal infighting on the political parties to the right.
So it was a great strategy then. The socialists had this slogan, "Together we continue and achieve." Talking about the turnout, it was the highest since the 2011 Portuguese legislative election.
In one sense, it was the third election in 1 year during a pandemic. On the other hand, there was a real sense that no one could actually reach an absolute majority. But the right wing, the Social Democratic Party, is very much scarred by the 2011-2015 government. So there was a lot of instability, a lot of insecurity in those years. And on the other hand, there was a fear that the right wing as a whole, so the Social Democrats with the Liberal Initiative, maybe with the Christian Democrats and the radical populist right, could have a majority in parliament, especially because the Social Democrats, under the leadership of Rui Rio, already had made a deal with the radical populist right in the regional government of Açores. António Costa, the prime minister, leader of the Socialists, was also a bit vague of what would happen if he didn't win the elections. There was kind of a blackmail vote because Costa also said that even if he had a relative majority, he would take the appropriate consequences, never saying or explicitly what those consequences were. And I think many people who voted for the Socialist Party did not want an absolute majority from the Socialist Party because the last absolute majority of the Socialist Party was also very tumultuous. This win for the Socialist Party was not a win entirely on their merits. It's also on the faults and absences of other political parties.
You mentioned some Portuguese cities earlier. Let's take now a closer look at the map. Even if the socialists managed to cover almost the whole country, election results show that the Liberal Conservative Social Democratic Party was somewhat stronger in the north of the country, plus on the Isle of Madeira, while the right-wing populist CHEGA and the communist eco-socialist Unitary Democratic Coalition seemed to be quite popular in the southern regions of Portugal, especially in less urbanized zones. What else can be said about the political geography of Portugal?
I think maybe 90% of the population of Portugal lives on the coast. The north tends to be more conservative, tends to lean more right-wing. The interior in the center and the north tends to lean right. But then the coastal areas from the center to the south tend to lean left-wing. And also the rural south was considered to be a stronghold also of the Communist Party, but it's been waning. And even the other strongholds of the Communist Party, like Margem Sul, so south of Lisbon, they've been losing it in the last decade. Madeira Island has always been Social Democrat from the start, never other political party ruling it, while the Açores tends to be always socialist. There have been academic studies on it. The electorate of CHEGA is very similar, for instance, of the electorate of Vox in Spain. It goes predominantly male, predominantly young, predominantly without university education. The CHEGA has been gaining some traction, especially in rural, previously communist strongholds. There has always been a radical right support in the outskirts of Lisbon, but generally the radical right had been scattered among different right-wing parties. But CHEGA in itself is also ideologically diverse. So it's not only radical right. There's also a lot of ultra-conservatives, religious people, and it has been garnering the support of many protest voters.
And talking about the smaller parties, as mentioned earlier, the environmentalist and animal rights and welfare activist People, Animals, Nature Party suffered losses and won one seat in the election, while the eco-socialist Livre Party managed to hold its single seat in the parliament with party leader Rui Tavares being elected in the capital city. The Ecologist Party, called the Greens, and the Conservative Christian Democratic CDS People's Party lost all of their seats for the first time. And how do you see the evolution of anti-establishment parties in your country? Which are the strongest items on their agenda?
Marxists, leftist parties like the communists and the left bloc, I'm not sure if they can still be considered anti-establishment, because they have been for the longest time considered to be only protest parties out of the government arch, and during 4 years they supported in parliament the government by the Socialist Party. Due to these results, they have been quite tame in criticizing the socialist government. The Socialist Party blamed the rejection of the national budget on them, calling them extremists, irresponsible, destabilizing political parties. And I think these parties will want to fight that narrative. People, Animals and Nature Party almost lost all seats in parliament. So it gained 4 seats in 2019. And I think there was internal divisions, and I think 3 MPs left the political party. There'll be obviously a quest and a run for the leadership of that party. Livre, it expelled Joacine Catar Moreira, which is a racialized person who stuttered and was considered an eco-feminist. But there was a huge scandal or disagreement between her and the political party. So Livre, although managed to elect in 2019, they didn't have political representation since 4 months after the election. So they now regained a seat in parliament. I'm not sure if we could call the communists and the left bloc as anti-establishment anymore. In one sense, there's the Christian Democrats, which have long been an establishment party, but right now they're out of the establishment, they're out of parliament. I think there's a strong possibility that the Christian Democrat Party will disappear. So CHEGA elected, I think, 12 MPs. It's basically a political party, very similar in style and rhetoric to Trump and Bolsonaro. There is a very high risk, almost a certainty, that the political party will be normalized or considered normal within liberal democratic institutions. They elected, for instance, Gabriel Mitar Ribeiro, which was a teacher at university, so an intellectual of African descent, and I believe he's also Muslim. So it's a very strange, a very unique combination for a populist radical right party. Portugal is not a country of entry in the EU for refugees. Unlike also in Spain, there's also the Catalonia independence issue where Vox can mobilize a lot of people. CHEGA in Portugal does not have a political issue or a programmatic topic which it can build on. Mostly the target of CHEGA is generally the minorities, sexual minorities, but also in particular racial minorities, such as the Gypsy community. Ventura, which is the leader of the party, actually was a candidate for the Social Democrats in the local elections of 2017. And his whole introduction speech to his campaign was pretty much a rant on the Gypsy community.
Talking about André Ventura, he said that the majority of the socialists is primarily due to the social democratic leader Rui Rio's failure to build a coalition between the 2 right-wing parties. And Ventura claimed that from now on, there won't be a soft opposition. CHEGA will assume the role of being the real opposition to the socialists and restore dignity to the country, he said. But also, the head of the Liberal Initiative stated that his party would represent a strong opposition against socialism. While the Prime Minister António Costa from the winning Socialist Party said that absolute majority doesn't mean absolute power, and that despite the fact that establishing a coalition is no longer required to govern, he remains open to the idea. And Costa also promised reforms, claiming that the conditions have been set for Portugal to become more wealthy and more innovative by implementing investments and reforms. So what kind of composition should we expect for the new government? Do we know any exact ministerial nominations?
Not yet. So the government will take office later this February. Costa has said that an absolute majority does not mean absolute power, but it's mainly rhetoric. The Socialist Party and the Social Democrat Party are catch-all parties. Their main function is to govern. At this point, it's in the interest of the Socialist Party to maintain a weak Social Democratic Party and a somewhat strong Liberal Initiative and somewhat strong CHEGA. Because in that sense, the Socialist Party can still maintain kind of neuter, keep mobilizing the votes to its left on the Socialist Party, avoiding that the left bloc and the Communist Party would gain more seats that would represent less seats for the Socialist Party. On the other hand, it maintains like a chokehold on the electorate of the left, and it maintains kind of a chokehold, especially on the Social Democrats, because it kind of forces the Social Democrats to either refuse or engage with the radical right. And in radical right, I kind of include also the Liberal Initiative. It's in the interest of the Socialist Party that the Social Democrats maintain like the 20-something, 30% of the vote or even less. And I think the Liberal Initiative has the potential to grow even more. And it can also grow into the Social Democrats' electorate. If the Social Democrats are faced in a position that they cannot gain power because they will never have an absolute majority, and the only possibility is of a coalition between the radical right and them, then it pretty much forces the Social Democrats to move towards the right, and the Socialists become the only political party on the center, while avoiding being outflanked by the left.
As a conclusion, let's go through the international reactions. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, leader of the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, congratulated Costa, stating that together we will continue to promote in our countries and in Europe a socialist response to the challenges we share. The European Commission's first Vice President, Frans Timmermans, stated that Costa's re-election was an important victory for Portugal and Europe. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also congratulated Prime Minister Costa, who is of Luso-Indian origin. In addition, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former president of Brazil and the presidential pre-candidate in the 2022 Brazilian general election, was also among the first to congratulate Costa for the great electoral victory. What are the main tasks and responsibilities of the new Portuguese government, both in terms of interior and foreign policies?
First of all, there's the RRP, so the Recovery and Resilience Plan, which has been highly touted by António Costa. Again, it's apparently a lot of money. It's the last opportunity. There's a window of opportunity to make some structural changes. The other, obviously, how it deals with the pandemic. Something that hasn't entirely been absent of the discussion is foreign policy or external influence. So the idea of inflation, barely anyone has uttered a word during the campaign. Costa was elected in 2015 with a critical discourse on the European Union's handling of the financial crisis. I don't remember ever another Socialist Party leader being as critical as he was. And he wasn't very critical, certainly not to the extent of the left bloc or the Communist Party. The way he ruled up until this point gained him a lot of attention from the international media. It's possible that he will have some sort of role to play in European politics. For numerous years or decades, it was considered impossible that the Socialist Party would negotiate or deal with the left bloc or the Communist Party. I know that CHEGA will pretty much still continue to replicate whatever strategy that Vox or Bolsonaro or Trump will do. I think Rui Rio was the only one who actually talked about inflation. I'm not sure the Portuguese electorate has any positions on what the foreign policy of the Portuguese government should be, because it's never been a question, in part because the Portuguese identity is pretty much a set in stone narrative. The idea that Portugal has to connect with the oceans because we have a history of traveling and seafaring. Also because the government from 2015 from 2019 was pretty much silent on those issues.
Alexandre de Sousa Carvalho from the University of Coimbra, thank you very much for being our guide to the recent Portuguese parliamentary elections. Now we possess of a clearer picture about the background of the legislative ballot, the Portuguese party system, and the current hot topics in your beautiful country. We wish you all good luck for your future endeavors. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Invitation.